Welcome to the Metapolitical Podcast, where we analyze politics beyond ideology, focusing on what is, not what should be. This is your host, Jim Jakiko. It is federal budget season in Canada, and this week the Carney government is going to table its budget, its first ever budget since it got elected in April of 2025. Canadians have not seen any kind of budget for 18 months, and as a result, they are antsy and anxious to see one, specifically from an untested prime minister who, during the campaign, leaned very much into his experience as the former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. In the weeks leading up to what we might call the Liberal budget reveal, the Conservatives have demonstrated strong messaging discipline, calling for an affordable budget for an affordable life every chance they got. From Pierre Poilievre, leader of the Conservative Party, to the last backbencher, everybody has been emphasizing this framing, that the government needs an affordable budget, that spending is out of control, and that we need fiscal restraint. This frames itself as common sense. Of course, budgets should be affordable. Of course, government should be responsible with money. But what does affordable actually mean in this context? Affordable to who? And what happens to costs when government stops covering them? That's what we're going to examine today. Why don't we start with the framing itself? An affordable federal budget treats the government budget like a household budget. The government needs to live within its means. It shouldn't spend more than it takes in. It needs to tighten its belt, cut unnecessary expenses, and be fiscally responsible. This resonates because we all manage household budgets. We understand living within our means. We know what happens when you spend more than you earn. So applying that logic to government seems intuitive. But here's the first question. Is government finance actually like household finance? We know governments aren't households. They have different constraints, different capabilities, and different purposes. A government issues currency, it collects taxes, it can borrow at rates households cannot. It operates across time horizons that households don't. It provides collective goods that households cannot provide individually. So the household budget metaphor, while intuitive, may be obscuring more than it's revealing. But you know what? Let's set that aside for now and focus on something more fundamental, the question of affordability. When we say the national budget needs to be affordable, we need to ask, affordable to whom? Is it the government, the taxpayers, the citizens? These might sound like the same thing, but they're not. One really important thing that we should remember whenever we talk of public budgets of any kind is that when the government doesn't spend on something, that cost doesn't disappear. It doesn't vanish into thin air. It just gets shifted. So if the government doesn't pay for it, someone else has to. Usually, that someone else is individuals, families, or businesses. So when we talk about an affordable government budget, what we're often really talking about is shifting costs from the collective public ledger to individual private spending. Let's say the government cuts healthcare spending to make the budget more affordable. That spending cut doesn't eliminate the need for healthcare. People still get sick. They still need treatment. They still need medication. So what happens? Individuals pay more out of pocket. They pay higher insurance premiums. They pay for services that were previously covered. They pay for medications that were previously subsidized. The cost didn't disappear. It shifted from the government's budget to citizens' budgets. Or take education. The government cuts education funding to reduce spending. Do children stop needing education? No. So what happens? Families pay more. They pay for private tutoring. They pay higher fees for after-school activities. They pay for resources the schools can no longer provide. Or they accept worse educational outcomes, which has costs down the line, costs that eventually show up as lost productivity, higher social spending, reduced earnings. Again, the cost didn't disappear, it just shifted. Or how about infrastructure? Say the government cuts infrastructure spending. Do roads stop deteriorating? Do bridges? No. So what happens? Individuals pay more in car repairs from bad roads. They pay more in time stuck in traffic because infrastructure is inadequate. Businesses, well, they pay more in logistics costs. Communities accept degraded infrastructure with all the associated costs, accidents, inefficiency, reduced economic activity. The cost, again, just shifted. This is the fundamental paradox of the affordable budget framing. Making the national budget affordable often means making individual life less affordable. The government's budget becomes more affordable precisely by shifting costs onto citizens. So we need to ask, what is actually being made affordable here? Not life, not the things people need, just the government's accounting. And it gets more interesting than that. When costs shift from collective public provision to individual private provision, something else happens. The total cost often goes up. It's not just that the same cost is being paid by different people, it's that the cost itself increases. And there are several reasons for this. First, you lose economies of scale. When government provides something collectively, it is doing so at scale, millions of people. This creates negotiating power, bulk purchasing, shared infrastructure. When individuals purchase the same thing separately, they lose all of that. They're paying retail prices. They have no negotiating power whatsoever. They are each bearing administrative costs that could have been shared. They're duplicating expenses that could have been consolidated. For example, when a government program negotiates drug prices for millions of people, it has enormous leverage. Pharmaceutical companies want that contract, so they'll negotiate. But when you, as an individual, go to buy medication, what leverage do you have? You have to pay what they charge. The same medication costs more per person when purchased individually than when purchased collectively. You also lose risk pooling. Insurance, whether health, unemployment, disability, it works through pooling risk. When everyone is in the pool, risks are distributed. Some people need a lot of care, some need little, but everyone pays in and the costs average out. This is most efficient with the largest possible pool. When you fragment that into smaller private pools or individual coverage, the cost per person goes up. High risk individuals can't get coverage or pay extremely high premiums. Low risk individuals might opt out, which then makes the pool riskier, which then raises prices, which makes more people opt out. It is a spiral. The same total risk costs more to manage when it's fragmented than when it's pooled collectively. And then you have the market failures. Some goods and services just don't work well in markets. Healthcare is a classic example. Think about this. When you're having a heart attack, you are not going to shop around because you can't. You can't compare prices. You can't negotiate. You take what's available and pay what they charge. There's information asymmetry where, the provider knows more, far more than you do. There's no real competition in emergency situations. These are conditions where markets don't produce efficiency. Private provision can end up being more expensive and lower quality than public provision precisely because market mechanisms don't work well for these goods. So now we're getting a clearer picture of what actually happens under affordable budget policies. Government cuts spending, costs shift to individuals, but because of lost economies of scale, lost risk pooling, market failures, and coordination costs, individuals end up paying more in total than they would have paid in taxes for public provision. The government's budget got more affordable, but life, that just got less affordable. And not just less affordable in the sense that the same cost is now coming out of your pocket instead of being covered by taxes. Less affordable in the sense that the total cost is higher. This is the paradox. Affordable budget policies can and do make life more expensive. The government saves money, you spend more money, the total societal cost increases. But the framing, well, that only focuses on the government side of the ledger. Now, what does this framing obscure? Several things. First, It obscures that government spending isn't just cost, it's also cost sharing. When the government pays for something through taxes, that is a way of distributing the cost across the population according to ability to pay. When that shifts to private spending, everyone pays the same regardless of ability to pay. A low income person and a high income person, they both pay the same for medication, for private school, for tolls on a privatized road. The cost burden falls more heavily on those with less. It also obscures that the inevitable outcome of an affordable government is unaffordability for people without means. If you have resources, you can absorb the shifted costs. You can pay for private healthcare, private education, private everything. If you don't, then you can't. So the shifted costs hit you harder. You either go without, or you pay and it devastates your budget, or you go into debt. The government's budget is affordable, but your life isn't. It also reframes the conversation away from the comparison that should probably be made when we're talking about federal budgets. The comparison isn't government spending versus no spending. It is collective spending versus individualized spending. It's taxpayer cost versus out-of-pocket cost. It's efficient public provision versus inefficient private provision. But affordable budget rhetoric frames it as if cutting government spending is saving money in general, when in fact it's not. It's really just shifting how money is spent and often increasing the total amount spent. And then there's this massive misunderstanding of what government spending actually is. It's not the government consuming resources for its own sake. It's the government purchasing goods and services on behalf of citizens. Healthcare spending is buying healthcare for people. Education spending, you can say the same. When you cut that spending, you're not eliminating the thing. It's still going to cost money. You're just changing who pays for it and how it's provided. And as we have discussed, that often makes it more expensive per person. The phrase affordable budget is not a simple, neutral, descriptive group of words that describes what kind of budget we're going after. It does quite a bit of political heavy lifting when it comes to prescribing what the government should or should not spend money on. First, it makes tax cuts seem like they're saving people money. If government spending is reduced, taxes can be cut. You can keep more of your paycheck, which, that sounds good. But if your costs for healthcare, education, childcare, transportation, and everything else go up by more than your tax cut, you're not really better off. You are, in fact, worse off. But the framing focuses attention on the tax side and ignores the cost side. Second, it frames government spending as burden rather than investment or insurance. Spending is something the government does that needs to be minimized, sure. But another way to think about it is government spending is a collective investment. We pool resources to build things we all benefit from. Or as collective insurance, perhaps, we pool risk so no one is devastated by bad luck. Those framings make spending look different. But affordable budget as a phrase treats spending as if it's pure cost with no return. And third, it shifts the political conversation from what do we need collectively to what can the government afford. Instead of asking what outcomes we want and what it takes to achieve them, we start with a constraint of affordability and work backward. We ask what we can afford rather than what we need. So this puts fiscal constraint as a priority before social outcomes. And perhaps another thing to think about, it serves the interests of people who can afford the shifted costs. If you have resources, you can handle the shift from public to private provision. You can pay out of pocket for healthcare. You can send your kids to private school. You can live in areas with good privately maintained infrastructure. But if you don't have resources, the tax cut is small and the cost shift is devastating. So, affordable budget policies tend to benefit those who are already comfortable while harming those who are already struggling. And it's not just immediate financial costs that shift and increase either. There are social costs that eventually circle back to financial costs. They're just delayed, or diffused and harder to trace to their source. When you cut public education, for example, and families have to compensate privately, what happens to children whose families cannot compensate? They get less education, fewer skills, reduced earning potential. That means lower lifetime earnings, which means less tax revenue for government down the line. It means lower productivity for the economy, and it means higher likelihood of needing social assistance later. It's less innovation, less economic dynamism, less overall growth. The government saved money on education today, but it loses tax revenue tomorrow, and it pays more in social costs later. When you cut social services like mental health programs, addiction treatment, homelessness services, those problems don't disappear. They become more expensive to manage in other ways. Untreated mental illness leads to incarceration, which is expensive. Emergency psychiatric care is also expensive. Lost workforce participation is lost tax revenue. Untreated addiction leads to crime, which requires policing, courts, incarceration. All of that is expensive. It leads to health crises, which require emergency care, also expensive. Homelessness without services means people cycling through emergency rooms, jails, shelters. Those are all expensive, all less effective than housing and services. The government saved money cutting social services, but incarceration costs are higher than treatment. Emergency interventions cost more than prevention. Lost productivity is lost tax revenue. Again, the costs didn't go away. They multiplied and showed up in other budget items. So as you can see, these aren't just social costs in some abstract sense. They're costs that circle back as reduced economic activity and reduced tax revenue, as well as an increased need for expensive interventions later. The government's budget looks affordable in the shorter term because costs were deferred or shifted, but the total cost, including eventual government cost, is often higher. You haven't actually made things affordable. You've just pushed costs into the future and spread them across society in ways that are harder to track. The insight here is that affordable is not a neutral descriptor for government budgets. It's a framing that directs attention to one part of the accounting, the government's budget, while obscuring the other part, which is the citizens' budgets. It treats these as if they are separate when, in fact, they're actually inverse. When one becomes more affordable, the other often becomes less affordable. Understanding all this doesn't really tell you what the right level of government spending is or what the actual budget item should be. It doesn't tell you what the government should do. Those are normative questions about values and priorities, but what it does tell you is that affordable budget is not a neutral goal. It is a particular allocation of costs that benefits some people and harms others. It's a way of framing that obscures cost shifting and cost increases while making spending cuts seem universally beneficial. So when someone calls for an affordable budget, always ask, affordable to whom and affordable compared to what? When these costs shift to individuals, what is the total cost? Who can afford the shifted costs and who cannot? These questions reveal what the framing is actually doing. And that brings us to the end of the episode. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next time.